Okay, tonight's screencast is going to go through managing the economy. And the first thing you need to understand is that there are two different types of economic policies. First, there's fiscal policy. That's taxing and spending. This has to do with the budget. We've gone through the budget process and we've looked at how Congress and the president are in charge of the budget process. And that's one that a lot of political factors can play into. Interest group influence, political party divides. So a lot of infighting in fiscal policy. Monetary policy, on the other hand, is the regulation of the money supply by the Federal Reserve Board. Federal Reserve Board is also called the Fed. And the main way that they influence monetary policy is the adjustment of interest rates. When you have low interest rates, then more money is circulating in the economy because more people are willing to borrow money. When you raise interest rates, then it contracts the amount of money that's flowing in our economy, and it tends to slow down inflation and slow down the economic pace. And so these are safeguards against the economy getting out of control. The Fed is independent. They're an independent regulatory agency. They are set up to be above politics. They are experts in their field, and they focus on doing things to fix the economy and keep the health of the economy up. And it allows Congress and the president to stay out of it. It keeps partisan battles out of monetary policy, and it protects our economy from the hostage situation that tends to occur with budget battles. Now, in terms of economic theories, we're going to go through a couple different theories here. We're going to start with Keynesian economics. And if we go back and we trace the history of economic policy, you start with the fact that the Constitution gave the federal government through Congress the right to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. That opened up a broad spectrum of powers to the Congress that has been realized over time. When the Industrial Revolution changed our country and changed the dynamics of our economic prowess, then Congress started to step in and do some regulation. They started to break up trusts and the big conglomerates of corporations. They regulated meat and drugs, and they regulated the railroads. And then the Great Depression happened, and we had even more regulation of the economy. And if you look at the Depression, that's a turning point. That's really the introduction of Keynesian economics into our economic engine. So with Keynesian economics, it's about government manipulating the health of an economy through spending. If you look at the New Deal, it was greatly influenced by the economic theories of John Maynard Keynes. So what Keynes suggested is that the government, through its spending, could change the way that the economy is working. If times are hard, like they are in an economic depression or a recession, then government could increase spending, even if it means running up large deficits. That would stimulate economic health. When the federal government is buying and they're in a spend mode, that's getting people out to work, that's getting money in the pockets of the American people who are then turning around and purchasing things, and that stimulates economic growth. The idea, though, is that when the economy starts to boom and get better, then the government contracts its spending. It helps to cool down the economy, and it leaves the spending more to the American people rather than the government. Now, we know in reality that that's a difficulty because once spending is started, it's hard to stop. If you look at the fighting that happens over the budget and the way that we argue over every little bit of spending cut, then you realize that Keynesian economics in reality is very difficult to implement when you're talking about the cooling down of federal payments and federal economic influence. The next two components of economic theories deals with supply side economics, which is cuts in taxes will produce business investment that will then offset loss of money due to lower taxes. So if you think about this, when you cut taxes, the idea is that businesses will now take that money that they have from lower taxes and will invest it back into their companies. When they do that, businesses will grow, they'll make more money, which means even though you're taxing them at a lower rate, you're still bringing in lots of revenue. They will hire more workers, these businesses will hire more people, and they will start to raise wages so that then You have more people working, and you have more people working at higher wages, which then brings in more tax revenue. So the theory here is that even if you cut taxes, in the initial impact will be a lowering tax base. Over time, you will see the growth of tax base revenue. Now, this was Ronald Reagan's economic theory that he looked to. From 81 to 89, we were all about supply side economics. Now, when Reagan instituted these tax cuts, he didn't actually offset it with spending cuts. So you saw the debt tripled from $1 trillion to $3 trillion, and that started us in our move towards heavy deficit spending. And Reagan's tax policies were complicated by the increased spending due to the Cold War. So supply side economics has a theory behind it of how you stimulate the economy from the upper echelons of society and cut taxes for the wealthiest, who will then spend that money and stimulate economic growth for all. Now, another theory is monetarism. Now, Keynesian, that we talked about a few minutes ago, deals with fiscal policy. That's all about the health of the economy is dealing with taxing and spending policies. There's another idea that it's really the money supply is the most important factor in dealing with the health of the economy, that the amount of money flowing through our system is critical. And that's where the Federal Reserve Board, or the Fed, comes into play. If the Fed sees that inflation is happening, that prices are rising too quickly, then they can tighten up the money supply. They can raise interest rates, and that'll tighten up lending. Or if they see that the economy is lagging, like we had in 2008 and beyond, what the Fed will do is they will lower interest rates, put it at such attractive rates that people will be more inclined to borrow and to invest using the lowered interest rates. Now, some things to understand, that when you manage the economy, you need to be very careful about how you go about doing that. And there's a couple things that have happened. First off, with trade policy, the United States has had a trade deficit over the past few decades. We import more goods than we export to other nations. So we've had some calls for protectionism, that there's a need to protect the United States from the unfair labor practices of other countries. In the United States, we have a lot of workers that make a good, strong wage. Well, when you compare that to some other third world countries, they're doing a lot of manufacturing and producing of goods. Those workers make very little money, and so the costs of doing business in other countries is very low, and those low costs lead to low prices, so American goods can't really compete. Now, there have been more of a push for free trade, though, through certain global initiatives. There's the Global Anti-Tariff Initiative. There's also the North American Free Trade Agreement. And I want to emphasize this one for a little bit. NAFTA, which was a big discussion of the Clinton economy in the 1990s, focused on opening up trade routes between Mexico and Canada and really making North America a single unified economy that shared and broke down the borders when it came to trade. We've seen that over the course of NAFTA's history, there's been some success and some failure with that, and it's a policy that's still in debate, and that each new president comes in and looks to put their own stamp on how they interpret NAFTA and how our relationships with our neighbors to the north and to the south are really going to work. Now, one last note on the economy. I want to talk about, the ideas that our government spending is getting out of control, and we've been faced with ongoing budget deficits, and that's been the norm for the past decade plus. And you should be aware of the fact that there has been a push for a balanced budget amendment, that Congress for years has debated the idea of amending the Constitution so that Congress would be locked into spending only as much as brought in by taxes and revenue. So we'd have a spending cap each year, that you could not go out of balance. Now, the reality is that this would be very hard for Congress to adhere to. We see budget crisis every year with negotiations between Congress and the president. So this would be a way for, to try to end that. But in reality, what we'd see is that flexibility would be gone from Congress. You'd have some problems with Congress trying to find ways to evade the amendment anyway. So there hasn't been a groundswell of support to actually get this through. Some of the alternatives proposed are that we do a line item veto, which we've talked about, where you allow the president to cut out wasteful spending with a strike of a pen when he's going through the budget. That's been deemed unconstitutional. So the solutions coming to how we get out of constant deficit spending, that's an ongoing issue that is still being looked at, and there's no solution that's easy on the horizon. So now, the final topic in the economy is, of course, government regulation. And this I kept a little bit separate because it's not so much about the government doing taxes or controlling money supply. It's about government getting involved with private businesses. And when we talk about regulation, by its pure definition, those are rules imposed by government on a business to achieve a desired goal. So if you're looking at the way that the government is operating in this realm, they're looking at a company that might be polluting and they want to get them to clean up their environmental practices. So they will regulate the way that the company produces things. Or the government wants better fuel efficiency in cars, so they're going to regulate the way that the manufacturers of automobiles can operate in this country. So this is a way for the government to kind of manipulate the way the businesses do things in our country. Now there are two types of regulation. There's economic, where that's government controls the behavior of businesses in the marketplace. These were things like the Sherman Antitrust Act, so trying to control the way that companies grew. Stock market regulations that prevent fraud and insider trading. Bans on false advertising. So those are some of the ways that they control the business in the marketplace. The other type of regulation is social, where government controls to correct the ill side effects of capitalism. This is where you see worker safety regulations. So when we had that whole thing about OSHA coming in and regulating the way that UPS workers could carry out their daily work, that was an example of a social regulation in the business realm. Now, the history of regulation really goes back to the 1890s when we were looking to fix things that were not safe. So it's unhealthy products, the meat inspection plants. You had pesticides then in the 1960s, or unsafe automobiles in the late 1960s. So this became a way for the government to step in and fix things that were happening that were unhealthy for American people. It was also a chance for business to be constrained when it came to trusts and the growth of monopolies. Now, in recent years, we've seen that there's been a growth of corporate mergers, and you see these companies getting bigger and bigger, like Time Warner and AOL merged together. Now, Comcast is trying to purchase Time Warner, and you get these large companies. The government's been very reluctant to stop these major mergers, and the only time they really stepped in was with Microsoft. And they went after Microsoft for an antitrust violation and ended up breaking Microsoft into several different divisions. And that was big news because it was so different. And so all this regulation is carried out by agencies like the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, or the Securities and Exchange Commission. Now there are two sides to the argument about regulation. Those that argue for regulation say that it prevents unhealthy monopolies, that it protects consumers from unsafe and unhealthy products, that it protects consumers from unsafe practices, such as airline pilots can't fly for an excessive number of hours. It protects working people from unsafe working conditions. It protects those who don't have a strong voice, poor consumers, and protects against excessively high prices. Now, on the other side, people that argue against regulation say that the regulation is not needed. We have a market-based economy, and the market will correct the inadequacies in our businesses, that businesses that can't compete will just go away because the market will compel these businesses to work for the benefit of the consumers. They say that regulation is inefficient, that businesses have to hire people to comply with regulations, and that makes U.S. business less competitive than the rest of the world. They say that regulation kills jobs because we aren't competitive in the world, so therefore we lose business to other nations. People argue that regulation increases prices, that when government has to impose a regulation on a business, then those businesses are going to pass that cost down onto the consumers. And then they say that business regulations have become unreasonable, that the government is looking to do all sorts of things to offset the normal practices of business, and that's just getting very excessive in its regulation.